The summer heat in Oak Ridge Estates was relentless that July, the kind that turned asphalt into bubbling tar and made even the shortest walks to the mailbox feel like trudging through the Sahara. But for Thomas Mitchell, the sweltering temperature wasn't his primary concern as he stood beside his decade-old above-ground pool, hands on hips, surveying what had once been the crown jewel of his modest backyard. "Well, old girl, I think it's time we said goodbye," he muttered, running a callous hand along the pool's faded blue siding. At 42, Thomas had lived in the same single-story ranch home for nearly 15 years. He purchased the place shortly after his divorce, a fresh start in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the HOA was mercifully non-existent and the neighbors, for the most part, minded their own business. The pool had been installed 3 summers after he moved in, a small luxury he'd afforded himself after a particularly good year at the architectural firm where he worked. But now the pool was more burden than pleasure. The liner had developed several slow leaks that no amount of patching seemed to fix. The pump made concerning grinding noises whenever it ran for more than an hour, and the chemical balance had become a weekly battle that Thomas was increasingly losing interest in fighting. The final straw had come yesterday when he noticed a concerning bulge in the sidewall, a structural issue that would cost more to repair than the pool was worth. "Everything all right over there, Tom?" called a friendly voice from across the fence. Thomas turned to see Miguel, his neighbor of 12 years, peering over the wooden fence that separated their properties. Miguel was one of the good ones, the kind of neighbor who would collect your packages if you were out of town, but never pry into your business. "Yeah, just contemplating the end of an era," Thomas replied, gesturing toward the pool. "Think it's finally time to take this thing down." Miguel nodded sympathetically. "Can't say I blame you. My kids used to beg to come over and swim, but now they're all grown up with their own places." "Exactly," Thomas sighed. "It just doesn't make sense anymore. I'm rarely home enough to use it, and the maintenance is becoming a pain." What Thomas didn't mention was that behind his practical reasoning lurked another motivation, one that had been gradually taking shape over the last few months. He had been sketching plans for a workshop, a place where he could pursue his growing interest in woodworking. The pool occupied prime real estate for such a structure. As Miguel wished him luck and disappeared back into his yard, Thomas didn't realize that his decision was about to trigger a neighborhood drama of epic proportions. Had he known what awaited him, he might have reconsidered the timing. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. The following Saturday morning, Thomas woke with the sun, a surge of energy propelling him out of bed. Today was pool demolition day, and he'd spent the previous evening gathering the necessary tools and watching several YouTube tutorials on the proper dismantling of above-ground pools. He'd invited his brother Kevin to help, sweetening the deal with promises of beer and barbecue once the job was done. Neither of them could have anticipated that by sunset, they would be explaining themselves to local law enforcement while a red-faced woman in a designer tracksuit screamed about property values and neighborhood aesthetics from the edge of Thomas's driveway. But the day was young, and as Thomas sipped his coffee on the back patio, mentally preparing for the task ahead, he was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just 3 doors down. By mid-morning, Thomas's backyard had transformed into a bustling worksite. His brother Kevin had arrived promptly at 9, bringing along an extra set of tools and the easy camaraderie that had defined their relationship since childhood. "So you're really doing this, huh?" Kevin asked, surveying the pool as he tightened work gloves over his hands. "End of an era. More like the beginning of a new one," Thomas replied, unfurling the detailed sketches he'd drawn for his future workshop. Kevin whistled appreciatively at the plans before they set to work. The process began with draining the remaining water, a task that had already been partially completed over the previous days. Thomas had run a hose from the pool to the street gutter, making sure to dechlorinate the water first, a detail he'd researched thoroughly to avoid any environmental issues. As they carefully dismantled the pump system, Thomas felt a strange sensation prickling the back of his neck. He glanced up to find a woman standing at the edge of his property, arms crossed tightly over her chest. He didn't recognize her immediately, though he knew she lived a few houses down. The large colonial with the immaculately landscaped front yard and luxury SUV in the driveway. "Morning," Thomas called with a friendly wave. The woman didn't wave back. "What exactly are you doing?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising volume. Thomas straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Taking down my pool. It's seen better days." The woman, whose name Thomas vaguely recalled as Victoria or Valerie, took several steps closer, her designer sunglasses perched on top of her highlighted blonde hair. "You can't just remove a pool without proper permits and neighborhood consultation." Kevin shot Thomas a bewildered look, but Thomas maintained his polite demeanor. "Actually, since it's an above-ground pool and there's no permanent structure involved, I don't need any special permits. I checked with the county office." Victoria, or was it Vanessa, sniffed dismissively. Well, I'm on the Neighborhood Beautification Committee, and we have standards to maintain. Property values depend on consistency and appropriate aesthetics. Thomas blinked in confusion. I wasn't aware our neighborhood had a beautification committee. We don't have an AOO. It's unofficial, she replied tersely. But we take it very seriously. What are you planning to replace it with? Not some tacky shed, I hope. At this point, Kevin stepped forward, the friendly smile on his face not quite reaching his eyes. Ma'am, we've got a lot of work to do here. Thomas has all the proper clearances for this project. The woman, who Thomas now remembered was named Veronica Peterson, narrowed her eyes. I'll be watching this situation closely. Our neighborhood has maintained its charm for 20 years, and we don't appreciate sudden changes that could affect all our home values. With that, she turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, phone already pressed to her ear. What the hell was that about? Kevin asked once she was out of earshot. Thomas shrugged. No idea. I've lived here 15 years and barely exchanged 10 words with her before today. They returned to their work, methodically removing the pool's frame after cutting away the liner. The metal supports came apart easily enough, but the process was time-consuming. By early afternoon, they had dismantled roughly half of the pool's structure when Thomas noticed increased activity on the street. Neighbors who normally paid him little attention were suddenly finding reasons to walk by his house. Some slowed their cars as they drove past. A few even stopped to chat with Veronica, who had established what appeared to be a monitoring station on her front porch, complete with binoculars and a notepad. You've got quite the audience, Kevin remarked dryly as they paused for a water break. Thomas shook his head. I never thought removing my own pool would cause such a stir. What neither of them realized was that Veronica Peterson had already initiated a chain of events that would escalate the situation beyond anything Thomas could have imagined. As they returned to their labor, the police cruiser rolled to a stop in front of Thomas's driveway, its arrival announced by the crunch of tires on pavement rather than flashing lights or sirens. Officer Dave Ramirez stepped out, adjusting his hat against the afternoon sun as he surveyed the scene. At 34, Dave had been with the Oak Ridge Police Department for nearly a decade and knew the neighborhood well. He recognized Thomas from the community cleanup days and various town functions. Afternoon Thomas, Officer Ramirez called as he approached the yard, where disassembled pool parts now lay organized in neat piles. Got a complaint about some kind of code violation happening here? Before Thomas could respond, Veronica Peterson materialized as if summoned, marching across the street with the determined gait of someone who had waited her entire life for this moment. Two other neighbors trailed behind her at a cautious distance, clearly interested in the drama but hesitant to be directly associated with it. Officer, thank goodness you're here, Veronica announced, slightly out of breath despite the short distance she traveled. This man is dismantling a pool without proper permits or environmental considerations. Who knows what chemicals he's dumping? And he's planning to replace it with some kind of workshop shed that will absolutely destroy our neighborhood aesthetic. Officer Ramirez turned to Thomas with a raised eyebrow. That true? You building a meth lab back here, or something? A slight quirk at the corner of his mouth suggested he already knew the answer. Thomas wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward. Just removing my above-ground pool, officer. It's old, damaged, and not worth repairing. I checked with county code enforcement last month. No permits needed for removing non-permanent structures on private property. He's lying, Veronica interjected. Every home improvement project requires neighborhood approval. It's in the community guidelines. Kevin, who had been silently observing the exchange, let out an undisguised snort. What community guidelines? This isn't an a-hole neighborhood. Officer Ramirez nodded slowly. He's right, ma'am. This area doesn't fall under homeowner association jurisdiction. As long as Mr. Mitchell here is complying with county regulations, there's no violation. Veronica's face flushed a deep crimson. But what about the environmental impact? He's probably dumping chlorine straight into the storm drains. That's illegal. Actually, Thomas interjected calmly, producing a folder from a nearby table. I've been following EPA guidelines for pool decommissioning. I got all the documentation here, including water testing results showing the water was properly dechlorinated before draining. The county environmental officer signed off on my plan last week. He handed the folder to Officer Ramirez, who flipped through it with apparent interest. Looks like you've done your homework, Thomas. Veronica wasn't ready to concede. Well, what about noise ordinances? They've been making a racket all day. Officer Ramirez checked his watch. It's 3:15 in the afternoon on a Saturday, ma'am. Noise ordinances allow for construction and home improvement work between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. on weekends. By now, a small crowd had gathered at the edge of Thomas's property. Miguel stood with his arms crossed, clearly amused by the spectacle. An elderly couple from across the street watched with undisguised interest, while a young family with 2 children had paused their bike ride to take in the neighborhood drama. Veronica, sensing her position weakening, switched tactics. "Officer, this isn't just about regulations. It's about community standards. A workshop will decrease all our property values. I've already spoken with my real estate agent, who confirmed this could impact home prices by up to 15%. At this, Officer Ramirez couldn't suppress a chuckle. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I doubt a small workshop is going to tank the real estate market in Oak Ridge Estates. This isn't funny," Veronica snapped, her voice rising to a pitch that caused several onlookers to wince. "I paid $700,000 for my home, and I won't stand by while people like him transform this neighborhood into some kind of industrial zone." The "people like him" comment hung in the air for a moment, creating an uncomfortable silence. Thomas, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. Veronica Peterson had experienced many things in her 46 years of life: country club memberships, luxury cruise vacations, and the satisfaction of being the first on her block to install imported Italian marble countertops. What she had not experienced, at least not since her teenage years, was public humiliation. And yet here she stood in the middle of Oak Ridge Estates, with a dozen neighbors witnessing her husband's casual dismantling of her authority. "Brad," she said through clenched teeth, her voice unnaturally calm, "perhaps you're confused about the importance of our neighborhood initiatives." Brad, finally sensing the danger he was in, attempted to backpedal. "What I meant was, while it's not officially sanctioned, Veronica has put tremendous effort into maintaining community standards." "Stave it," Officer Ramirez interrupted gently. "Look, I appreciate everyone's concern for their neighborhood, but there's no violation happening here. Unless anyone has actual evidence of a county code infraction, I need to get back on patrol." That should have been the end of it. In a rational world, Veronica would have retreated gracefully, perhaps with a parting comment about keeping an eye on the situation. But something inside her, perhaps the culmination of years spent cultivating an image of neighborhood authority, or the sudden realization that her influence was merely perceived rather than actual, simply snapped. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that sent a nearby squirrel scurrying up a tree. "I will not be dismissed like some common complainant. Do you have any idea who I am in this community?" The crowd, which had been beginning to disperse, froze in collective fascination. Thomas and Kevin exchanged glances, silently debating whether they should retreat into the house or continue witnessing what was rapidly becoming the neighborhood spectacle of the decade. Officer Ramirez, maintaining a professionalism that would later earn him commendations from his colleagues, kept his voice level. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but—" Upset. Veronica's voice rose even further, a feat that seemed biologically improbable. "I am not upset, officer. I am outraged. This neighborhood has standards that I have personally maintained for the past 8 years." She spun toward the gathered neighbors, arms outstretched like an orchestra conductor demanding attention. "Who organized the holiday light competition that put our subdivision on the local news? Who convinced the Johnsons to repaint their hideous yellow garage door? Who single-handedly prevented the Roberts family from installing that ghastly above-ground pool they wanted?" From the back of the crowd, Mrs. Roberts' indignant voice called out, "So it was you who kept calling the county with anonymous complaints." This revelation created a ripple of murmurs through the assembled neighbors. Veronica, apparently past the point of strategic consideration, didn't deny it. Someone had to maintain standards around here, she declared, hands now planted firmly on her hips. She turned back to Thomas, jabbing a finger in his direction. "And you think you can just tear down neighborhood assets without consequences? What's next? Parking a trailer in your driveway? Painting your house purple? Installing lawn flamingos?" Thomas, who had remained remarkably composed throughout this surreal confrontation, finally spoke up. "Veronica, this pool was on its last legs. I'm replacing it with a tasteful workshop where I'll pursue my woodworking hobby. If anything, it will improve the property's appearance." Woodworking. She spat the word as if it were profanity. "So we'll all be subjected to the constant noise of power tools and the smell of varnish? Absolutely not." Officer Ramirez stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and calm down." "I will not calm down," Veronica declared, reaching into her designer handbag and dramatically producing her smartphone. "I'm calling the mayor right now. Jim and I play tennis every Tuesday." What Veronica didn't notice in her agitated state was that her husband, Brad, had been slowly edging away from her, a look of profound embarrassment etched across his features. He caught Thomas's eye and mouthed what appeared to be, "I'm so sorry," before turning to Officer Ramirez. "Dave," he said quietly, using the officer's first name in a way that suggested they were at least casually acquainted. "Maybe I should take Veronica home. She's been under a lot of stress with the committee work." But Veronica was beyond being managed. As she furiously scrolled through her contacts, she paced in small, tight circles, her monologue continuing unabated. This neighborhood is going downhill and nobody seems to care. Do you know what happened last month? The Wilsons' teenager was playing music after 9 o'clock, and when I mentioned it to them, they had the audacity to tell me that it was a Saturday. At this point, something extraordinary happened. Miguel, Thomas, a neighbor of 12 years, stepped forward from the crowd. The normally reserved man cleared his throat, immediately drawing everyone's attention. "Veronica," he said gently, "I've lived in this neighborhood for nearly 20 years, and I've never seen Thomas do anything that wasn't thoughtful and considerate. His pool has been a blessing for many families here. My kids learned to swim in it because Thomas was kind enough to invite the neighborhood children over during summer heat waves. If he says the pool needs to go, I trust his judgment." Other neighbors began nodding in agreement. Mrs. Diaz, the elderly woman from the corner house, spoke up. "Thomas shoveled my driveway all last winter when my arthritis was acting up. Didn't ask for anything in return. And he helped my son with a science project when the model bridge kept collapsing," added another neighbor. "He organizes the actual neighborhood watch program," someone else called out. Each testimonial seemed to deflate Veronica further, her righteous indignation giving way to the dawning realization that she was dramatically outnumbered. Her phone call to the mayor, it seemed, had been forgotten. Officer Ramirez, seeing an opportunity to defuse the situation, stepped in. "Sounds to me like Mr. Mitchell here is a valued member of this community. Now, unless there's an actual crime being committed, I think we can all go about our day." Veronica stood motionless for a moment, the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. When she finally spoke again, her voice had taken on a dangerous calm. "This isn't over," she declared, her gaze fixed on Thomas. "Not by a long." Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for Thomas and Kevin to complete the pool demolition. After the previous day's drama, several neighbors had offered to help, turning what had been a two-man job into something of a community event. By noon, Miguel had fired up his grill, Mrs. Diaz had brought over a pitcher of homemade lemonade, and the final pieces of pool material were being loaded into a rented dumpster. "I still can't believe yesterday happened," Thomas said, accepting a cold water bottle from Kevin. 15 years in this neighborhood, and I never knew there was so much passion about backyard renovations." "Passion is one word for it," Kevin chuckled. "Psychosis might be another." Miguel, flipping burgers nearby, lowered his voice. "Veronica's been quiet all morning. Curtains drawn, no sign of movement. Brad left early, saw him hurrying to his car around 7. Thomas shrugged. "Maybe she's reconsidered. Realized there are better things to worry about than someone else's backyard." The words had barely left his mouth when a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of his house. A man in a crisp suit emerged, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of professional detachment. He surveyed the gathering before making his way directly to Thomas. "Mr. Mitchell," he inquired, extending a business card. "Gordon Pratt, attorney at law. Do you have a moment to discuss a matter of some urgency?" Thomas exchanged bewildered glances with Kevin before accepting the card. "Sure. What's this about?" Gordon Pratt's eyes flicked to the neighbors gathered around, then back to Thomas. "Perhaps somewhere more private?" "Whatever you need to say, you can say it here," Thomas replied, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. "These are my friends and neighbors." The lawyer sighed almost imperceptibly before opening his portfolio. "Very well. I represent Mrs. Veronica Peterson in the matter of your unpermitted pool removal and planned construction. My client has filed for an emergency injunction citing potential damage to shared groundwater, noise pollution, and negative impact on surrounding property values." A stunned silence fell over the gathering. Kevin was the first to recover. "You're kidding, right? This is a joke." "I assure you, sir, this is no joke," Gordon replied stiffly. "Mrs. Peterson has also filed a formal complaint with the County Environmental Office regarding improper disposal of pool chemicals and potential contamination of soil." Thomas felt a flash of anger but kept his voice steady. "That's completely false. I followed every regulation to the letter. Officer Ramirez saw all my documentation yesterday. Regardless," Gordon continued, "my client has requested immediate cessation of all demolition activities until a formal environmental impact study can be conducted. I have the paperwork here." He produced several official-looking documents from his portfolio. Before Thomas could respond, the distinctive sound of a police siren chirped briefly, and a familiar cruiser pulled up behind the lawyer's SUV. Officer Ramirez stepped out, along with a woman in county uniform that Thomas didn't recognize. "Afternoon, folks," Officer Ramirez called, approaching the group with an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Got another call about this property. This is Sandra Lee from County Code Enforcement." Sandra Lee stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "We received multiple complaints about potential environmental violations at this address. I'm here to conduct an inspection." Miguel set down his spatula. "Multiple complaints? Let me guess, all from the same person? Sandra's professional demeanor didn't waver. I'm not at liberty to discuss the source of the complaints. I'm just here to do my job. Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. This is ridiculous. I have all the documentation showing I've followed proper procedures. I'm sure you do, Sandra replied, but I still need to conduct an inspection and file a report. It's standard procedure when we receive. Officer Dave Ramirez had spent 10 years on the Oak Ridge Police Force. He'd broken up bar fights, mediated domestic disputes, and once talked down a man threatening to jump off the Route 16 overpass. But in all those years, he'd never encountered anyone quite like Veronica Peterson, a woman whose self-importance had reached such astronomical heights that she'd managed to transform simple pool removal into a neighborhood crisis. Mrs. Peterson, Officer Ramirez said, flipping to a fresh page in his notepad with deliberate slowness, I need to discuss the matter of the numerous calls you've made to emergency services over the past 24 hours. Veronica's smile didn't waver, though something flickered behind her eyes. I was merely reporting violations as a concerned citizen, officer. That's my civic duty. 6 calls to the police department, 3 emails to the chief, and 2 calls to 911 dispatchers. Ramirez continued, his voice taking on an official tone that drew the news camera in his direction. All concerning a fully permitted home improvement project. The reporter, Alicia Dyer, sensing a shift in the story, moved closer with her microphone. Officer, are you suggesting Mrs. Peterson misuse emergency services? I'm not suggesting anything, Ramirez replied, looking directly at the camera. I'm stating facts. When citizens repeatedly report non-emergencies to emergency services, it diverts resources from genuine crises. In fact, he added, turning back to Veronica, making false reports to police is a misdemeanor under state law section 140.5. The color drained from Veronica's face. False reports? I was legitimately concerned about environmental violations that have now been officially cleared by county inspection, Ramirez finished for her, and noise complaints during permitted hours, and suspicious activity reports for a homeowner removing his own pool. And my personal favorite, a 911 call reporting potential evidence destruction when Mr. Mitchell was simply loading pool materials into a properly rented dumpster. The camera panned to Veronica, whose perfect composure was visibly crumbling. I was acting in good faith. Furthermore, Ramirez continued, seemingly on a roll now, you should be aware that filing frivolous legal injunctions can potentially expose you to countersuit for legal expenses and damages. Gordon Pratt, who had been observing from a cautious distance, suddenly found his leather shoes fascinating, studying them with intense interest. Thomas, watching this unfold, almost felt sorry for Veronica. Almost. Am I being charged with something? Veronica asked, her voice losing its authoritative edge. Officer Ramirez finally smiled. Not today, Mrs. Peterson. Consider this a formal warning. However, if we receive any more calls about Mr. Mitchell's legal home improvement projects, we'll have to take further action. He turned to the news crew. I think the real story here is how communities come together. Look around, neighbors helping neighbors, sharing a Sunday afternoon, supporting each other. That's what makes Oak Ridge special. The camera panned across the gathering, Miguel at his grill, Mrs. Dyes pouring lemonade, several neighbors working together to level the ground where the pool had been. It was, Thomas had to admit, a picture-perfect scene of suburban harmony. Alicia Dyer, quickly adapting to the changing narrative, stepped forward. It looks like what we're seeing today is less about a neighborhood dispute and more about community cooperation. Would you agree, Mr. Mitchell?